I'm Walter Cronkite. This is the story of a time and a city. The time, the 1920s. The city, New York, which provides a frenzied backdrop to a new golden age. This is not only the New York of Texas Guinan, but of H.L. Mencken, of George Gershwin, of cartoonist John Held Jr. and Peter Arno, of that caustic critic Alexander Woolcott, of playwright Eugene O'Neill, as well as the New York of the Herald Tribune's famous city editor Stanley Walker.
Even commuting, which I understand now has become the most horrible experience that could be imagined, was moderately bearable in those times. I know we didn't have the horrible turmoil and the tie-ups and you didn't have to ride with those boars that you, I understand, infest the trains, especially the Westchester and Connecticut trains today. It was in many ways a charming life.
This is our story, New York in the 20s, as the Prudential Insurance Company of America presents the 20th century. In the 20s, all roads lead to New York. Rising from an island of rock, the city invites youngsters eager to test their talents, men and women seeking success. It lures the refugees in flight from the Puritans and Philistines of Main Street. It beckons those out-of-towners who come for a wonderful visit but wouldn't want to live here. Is America's front door, welcoming the famous from overseas. Some pause briefly, some settle down, but no one passes it by. Mayfair's fairest, Gertrude Lawrence, arrives. H.G. Wells, novelist and prophet of things to come. Rebecca West, English lady of letters. Tennis star Suzanne Lenglen, tenors John McCormick, and Enrico Caruso. From every country and every art, Stanislavski, Koussevitzky, Paderewski.
So many people seem glad to see you. They don't seem that way today. They don't seem to care, or they seem offended when you show some gesture of friendship. But in those days, people seemed delighted to see me, and I know a great many young fellows who hit New York about the same time. They report they had the same experience.
Playwright Mark Connolly.
Microcosm. It was the New York of writers and other creative people. My New York had people who came from everywhere bound toward the realization of their talents more than to a geographic destination.
Greenwich Village, a city within a city, attracts most untried writers, artists, dramatists. Here, living is cheap and informal. The village is less a place than a way of life. Its alleys and patchwork streets offer an old-world tolerance to professional eccentrics. It provides an escape from the shame of not making money. It offers a peaceful backwater to those who wish to create in the company of other creators. Here, the exquisite Eleanor Wiley fashions her delicate verse, and Theodore Dreiser writes his rough-hewn prose. Here, Sherwood Anderson escapes the narrowness of Winesburg, Ohio, and Willa Cather, author of My Antonia, writes her novel about a lost lady. And here, the village belle, Edna St. Vincent Millay, composes her bittersweet sonnets. Says critic Edmund Wilson, the wit of her conversation was as sharp as the pathos of her poetry. The Provincetown Theater, a converted stable, provides Eugene O'Neill, America's greatest playwright, with his first New York stage. The city above the village recognizes O'Neill's enormous talents and brings him out of the stable and into Broadway's glittering company. With him, wife Agnes and daughter Una. On Broadway, Katharine Cornell is reaching for stardom in The Green Hat, while the versatile Englishman, Noel Coward, here with actress Hope Williams, startles New York in his play, The Vortex. The theater meets the literary world at the Hotel Algonquin. On hand, Mark Connolly.
A good many of the men and women that gathered every day for lunch at the Algonquin, the famous round table, became quite well known in various fields of creative work, criticism. Alexander Wolcott was searing, acid, rude. I used to feel sometimes that his only exercise was rancor, but he was engaging, was compelling, and amusing. His jokes were funny jokes. Edna Ferber, young, industrious. She used to scare us all to death by her habit of industry. George Kaufman was certainly one of the wittiest of that group. George's wit was neat. It had the sharpness of a silver point etching. Among the people at the table, the constant visitors, was Dorothy Parker, then making a name for herself by the brilliance and the skill and the beauty of her poetry. And among us was F.P.A., another round table constant attender. There was also Robert Benchley, Nisa McMean, the artist who painted every other magazine cover, and of course Charles MacArthur, the playwright. He was as close to the spirit of Pan, I suppose, as anyone could be. Haywood Broun, big, enormous, once referred to, a man who looked like an unmade bed, was one of the most generous, humane, certainly companionable men I ever saw. There was Ross, of course, Harold Ross, founder of the New Yorker. There was a speculation about Ross's curious head of hair. It was very high, very thick. Somebody once said that Jungle picture Chang had been filmed in it. I think it was George Kaufman who once said he looked like a dishonest Lincoln. He loved to give the impression of being just a country boy, very simple, unaffected man. And his jaw was always dropping, and he always listened like a green reporter listening to his first, out on his first interview, listening to a speaker. But he really had a brain that was magnificent. Oh, there were so many others. There were about 20 of us. Bob Sherwood, of course. Bob's manner was always sedate, always slow, as though he had difficulty finding the exact word, though few men writing in America ever found words with greater accuracy or more point. A lot of people who knew nothing about the personal lives or the attitudes among ourselves of the people who were at the round table thought it was a mutual admiration society and a log rolling organization. It was anything but that, because I promise you the worst pannings any of us received for our books or our plays came from the critical friends who were members of that group.
Some of the world's finest writers are published by Blanche and Alfred Knopf.
What attracted writers to New York in the 20s? I suppose to a degree it was these new publishing houses, which had to start almost from scratch, if not actually from scratch, who were run by younger men whose outlook on things was quite different from the men who were directing the destinies of the older houses. I think New York exercised its attraction primarily because the American Mercury was being published, the New Republic was there, the Nation was there, The old Metropolitan magazine, I think, was still in existence. Clarence Day was reviewing books for it. The Smart Set had been there earlier with Mencken's monthly piece on the theater, Nathan's monthly piece on the theater, and Mencken's on books. It was a lively place. A great figure in my life of the 20s was Willa Cather. Miss Cather was a very remarkable woman. She shared a certain quality with Henry Mencken, that of the feeling that friends could do no wrong and that people she didn't know could never do anything right. These were prejudices, but they were strongly held, and she remained an enormously loyal friend.
Sinclair Lewis is the first American novelist to win the Nobel Prize. His Main Street is an unsparing indictment of American small-town life.
Why did America suddenly develop an ability to take the criticism that was explicit in a book like Main Street and buy it to the tune, I think, of some 400,000 odd copies? I remember corresponding with my old friend John Galsworthy at the time, and his raising in one of his letters the question of whether Americans could take that kind of criticism. Well, obviously they did. And I think Main Street alone could be said to mark a certain coming of age of our people.
In the publication of the American Mercury, the fastidious George Jean Nathan joins forces with the irascible H.L. Mencken in a frontal attack on American smugness and small-mindedness. Criticism made palatable by Mencken's wit.
I don't think we're likely to see his like again. He was, of course, first and foremost, a great newspaper man. That was his first love. The Baltimore Sun was his basic responsibility. But in the early days, he read endlessly in fiction. He reviewed constantly all kinds of books for the Smart Set. He was widely read and extremely knowledgeable in medicine, in science, in theology, in the law, and of course in philology. He was also, to my mind, the greatest editor as such that I've ever known.
He was always interested not only in the solider aspects of literature, but being a newspaper man, he was always very much absorbed in what was going on in New York about the news stories. I know he covered the Dempsey-Carpentier fight, and he was very much interested in Valentino and in the Snyder Gray murder trial, all those things. And we had some great stories in those days. There was the Lindbergh flight later on, which seemed for a little while to make the human race believe that it had some decency about it. It might amount to something after all. A mood that very quickly passed. And there was all sorts of gangster goings-on. We killed quite as many people in New York in those days, I believe, as Chicago did, although Chicago had a much wilder reputation. That was largely, I think, because Chicago's more spread out, and you could take people for a ride, and it was more exciting, more romantic. New York, you had to kill people under much more cramped circumstances, and it didn't seem as interesting somehow. New York City was the great laboratory for what has been called the Prohibition experiment. One of the strangest things ever undertaken anywhere. Mr. Herbert Hoover called it an experiment noble in purpose, which people generally cut down to the noble experiment, which was not Hoover's words at all. But whatever it was, it disrupted, changed, and affected in one way or another the lives of millions of New Yorkers. Meanwhile, a lot of very good people were poisoning themselves on bathtub gin, and a lot of poor people were drinking stuff that was downright poisonous. It's a wonder that anybody is alive from that period today.
Every night in New York is Mardi Gras. More than 70 theaters cater to every taste. Just off Times Square is the Follies. An opening is a big event with prices to match. Everyone, including Mayor Jimmy Walker, turns out to see Ziegfeld's girls and Ziegfeld's stars like Helen Morgan.
He's just my Bill. He hasn't got a thing that I can brag about, and yet to be upon his knees, how comfy and roomy seems natural to me. I love him because he's wonderful, because he's
Ziegfeld star Fanny Brice clowns for husband Billy Rose.
I got a feeling I'm falling for nobody else but you. You caught my eye, now I got a feeling I'm falling. Show me that ring and I'll jump right through. I used to travel single all we chanced to mingle.
Ziegfeld is the grand old man of America's musical theater. It's young hope, George Gershwin, whose music brightens Carnegie Hall as well as Broadway, rehearses his Strike Up the Band.
Hey, George, talking to fella here yet?
Nope, they're not here yet.
Those fellows are always late. Tell you what we do. While we're waiting for them, let's take the girls and the buck dance to Strike Up the Band.
Good. All right, kids, come on, strike up the band. Hurry up. All right, ready.
The famous comedy team of Clark and McCullough.
Wait a minute. What's all this noise out here? Let's get going. Let's get some work done.
But you still don't know your lyrics to this show.
I'd know the lyrics if you could write some notes in this like you did in Rhapsody in Blue.
Oh, yeah? Well, listen, you're going to sing this Mademoiselle song and like it.
I like all your songs. How are you going to argue with a virtuoso?
Can't do it.
After the show, 8,000 places to go. The Romany Marie's, the Cotton Club, the Central Park Casino. The celebration continues into the small hours. At Texas Guinan's place, the party never ends. Says Texas, you may be all the world to your mother, but you're just a cover charge to me.
All right, start to sing this song, I want it understood that no sucker in this room has better mention how it works. I'll rave and swear and tear my hair because I want to kill that bum that wrote that song entitled California, Here I Come. Now, Mayor Walker wrote another song. And then he gave the music to the policeman's band to play. He dedicated it to Wallace, and the song sure is a wow. It goes. I used to love you, but it's over.
From the village to Harlem, from Riverside Drive to Sutton Place, the private parties are the best of all. There is no cover, no minimum, and no limit to the available talent. Actress Eileen McMahon, critic Robert Coleman, Haywood Broun, Charlie Chaplin. The same faces in different places. Illustrator Ralph Martin. Writer Philip Wiley. Menken and Nathan. Anita Luce. Clarence Darrow. Toscanini's daughter, Wally. Author Carl Van Vechten. And Ethel Barrymore. Menken with novelist Joseph Hergesheimer. Everyone has a good time. Koussevitzky. Eileen Pringle. Concert pianist Myra Hess.
And then, on a very memorable day in the fall of 1929, came the crash that saw most of us who had managed to accumulate some small amount of money, saw it all wiped out. And the attitude of every one of those people whom I knew and loved was the same. It was, well, we had it and it's gone. Now let's do something else. And we all did do something else. We all moved into the 30s.
I was thinking the other day that the things we worried about then, let's name a few of them. There's censorship. How far can we go in free speech and the free press? Just how far? How far can we go in believing that a certain type of government is really not perfect? And how far can we go in criticizing that without being called communists or anarchists or atheists or something sort? How far can any church or any group of churches go in interfering with the processes of politics or government, or even with the conscience of the individual citizen? Just how far? Can we really ever have a world government that will work? You go on and on. We've worried about those things a good deal. You know, we didn't settle one of them. Those are the identical problems that you're worrying about today. But we had a good time with it.
We felt that possibly a very dear friend had died. And of course, that friend was the 20s.
Next week at this time, the Prudential will present the first of 2 programs just filmed by the 20th century in Sweden. You will see and hear a report on the world's most highly developed welfare state and on its people, who some say are living in a troubled paradise. Next week, Sweden. Is there trouble in paradise? Part 1. This is Walter Cronkite reporting for the 20th century.